Well, folks, I just want to forewarn you here, because the topic I'm going to be talking about, the fiscal cliff, is not a pretty discussion. And just to give you fair warning on this, in another community in Alaska on Tuesday, the superintendent of the public school system came up to me and said, "Well, Chris, I was thinking about going back to the office and briefing my staff on what you said today, but after listening to you, I think I'm going to the bar to drink." So, just forewarning, just remember the light at the end of the tunnel is the raffle. Why everybody's here? Kathy set me straight and said, "Chris, the topic's interesting, but the reason everybody's here is the raffle." But seriously, thank you all for coming. It means a lot, and to be able to discuss what is by far the most important issue for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and we believe, for reasons, the most important issue facing this country in the immediate short term. Right now, the U.S. national debt is approaching $17 trillion. $17 trillion. Our GDP to debt ratio is 103%. In the history of humankind, no nation has survived long term with a debt to GDP ratio of 100%. And to put this into comparison, right now, Spain's is at 120%, and Greece's is at 140%. Greece is a functional failed state, but both of those have the German economic engine to back them up. So understanding that we have this massive national debt, that we're on the glide path for another $1.5 trillion deficit in the upcoming fiscal year, we've got to get a handle on this. But in the immediate and the short run, there is this thing called the fiscal cliff. Now, I'd like to see a show of hands, just so I have an idea. How many people in this room have obviously everybody's heard by now, I think, of the fiscal cliff, but how many of you feel like you've got a handle on what it actually means? Okay, so let me tell you what the fiscal cliff means. There are two components to it. We're 10 years on from the tax rate reductions that occurred at the beginning of the Bush presidency designed to stimulate economic growth. But there were sunset provisions put into those tax rate reductions. And so the so-called Bush tax cuts are expiring in December. In addition to it, we have something called sequestration that is coming due in December. And that was the deal that was struck by Congress in order to allow the debt ceiling to be raised last year, and this was the last-minute cobbled-together deal when the grand bargain fell apart, that said if Congress can't get its act together and figure out how to fix this thing, we're going to start the glide path on a downward spending trajectory by cutting $600 billion in programming from the U.S. government, with the hardest hit sector being national defense, and set another, with a total of $1.2 trillion in cuts over 10 years put into place. The effect of the two things happening at the same time, significant tax rate increases, which is effectively what we're talking about. We're not talking about expiration of tax cuts. We're talking about effective tax rate increases to the economy. At the same time, there's going to be a massive contraction on federal government spending. Has the potential to put our economy right back to where we were in a negative growth pattern. Right now, the U.S. economy at the end of the third quarter was growing at 2%. And economists generally agree that a 2.2% growth, sustained 2.2% growth, is about level for the U.S. economy. That's about where we need to be. Any faster, and we're heating up, but any slower than that, and we're drifting towards recession. The combined effect of these two things that we're looking at coming up in December would be to pull the U.S. economy back into a 0% growth, putting us right back square in the middle of recession, and also adding approximately 1% to unemployment. And the unemployment figure is truly scary once you start to look at the functionally unemployed out there. The combination of those two figures together becomes really genuinely scary. So that's the background of why this is such a threat. Now, there's a lingering issue. And the lingering issue is the fact that our debt was already downgraded, I believe it was Standard & Poor's, but that Moody's and Fitch have also announced that if they don't see a clear path, we're going to see the U.S. debt downgraded. If Congress breaks down completely in these negotiations with the president, we could actually see 1 or 2 grade downgrades. The effect of those downgrades can be to add inflation to a zero-growth economy. And as we all know, I mean, we start to be thinking about the 1970s again, the worst of the 1970s matched to the worst of what we saw back in 2009. And it's a really ugly combination for our nation. The irony is there is a grand bargain to be had, but it requires big picture thinking. And let me outline the grand bargain. And from the U.S. Chamber's perspective, I want to explain, because a lot of people actually don't understand the relationship between the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and local chambers of commerce. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce is the nation's largest business trade association. We have more than 3 million members nationwide. We don't run local chambers of commerce. We are a organization that is a bottom-up organization. Our policy is made by our individual business members and the chamber executives and the association executives, because there are more than 50 trade associations around the country that have also joined the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. And executives from all of those entities come together through a committee structure and create policy for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. 100 years ago, we were formed by more than 400 local chambers of commerce from around the country who said, you know, we've got a voice in our local community, and we're starting to get a voice in our state houses so the business community can speak with one voice. We really don't have that in Washington, D.C., and that's where the U.S. Chamber came from. So when I'm talking about what we're doing, this is sort of an organic upwards policy development. It isn't something that just 1 or 2 individuals have decided arbitrarily and are throwing out there. What we're saying is a grand bargain is absolutely critical to fixing this. And what does a grand bargain mean? It means that both sides are going to have to compromise. We've got to stop being Republicans and Democrats for a little while here, and we've got to start being Americans. That's the fundamental issue. We have got to figure out how we're going to get from A to B, which is getting the national debt on a downward path. Because right now, if we don't, and particularly if we don't reform entitlements, the spending on the 3 big entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, will subsume the entire federal budget by 2021. So that means no money for defense, no money for discretionary spending, no money for relief, no money for anything. Just the 3 entitlement programs. So if you want to know why entitlement reform is so important, that's the big piece that's out there. I will tell you the easy one of the 3 is Social Security reform. It can be done in a way that it doesn't impact anybody over the age of 55. And the change, if we act quickly on it, will not have dramatic effects on the younger beneficiaries. It's going to mean raising retirement ages slightly, and it will give you time, preferably on a sliding scale, to make adjustments in your retirement savings to help get to that point. A note I would add to that, though, nearly half of all Americans at the age of 40 have 0 in retirement savings. And that's a component to this piece as well that we have to consider as we're looking into this. So I say that entitlement reform is a key piece of the grand bargain. But what are the other pieces? Well, there are at least 2. One of them is comprehensive tax reform in the United States. The Chamber of Commerce has come out and said on behalf of our members that a lot of our business members are willing to accept changes, particularly in some of their deductions, in order to have a more stable tax structure in which businesses have certainty. We know how much we're going to pay coming down the line. And there are some exemptions out there that do need to be looked at and revisited. Everything should be on the table. It also means for individuals that we have to have a fairer tax structure where two people with the same number of children living in houses next door to each other aren't paying vastly different amounts of taxes. So the whole tax code needs to be looked at and rewritten in a way that is pro-growth oriented. And at the point, fundamentally, what we don't want to do is rewrite the tax code in a way that we're pulling so much more new money out of the U.S. economy that there's no money left in it for it to grow. Then the third part, and this is where we have seen some positive signs, but a national energy policy that helps the United States exploit its energy resources in a way that is going to help strengthen the U.S. economy. And we, frankly, and I'm just going to say this because I'm up here in Alaska and I'm from Washington State, it'd be helpful if politicians in Washington State would pay more attention to Washington State natural resources than Alaska's natural resources. But that's me speaking, not the U.S. Chamber speaking. A personal pet peeve of mine. The potential for all of the energy exploration that's going on in the United States, the potential for us to be energy independent. I think many of you have seen the headlines that the United States could be the world's largest oil exporter by 2020. I mean, these are some pretty amazing opportunities that are out there. The clean technology has moved so far forward in this country now that some of the issues that we used to be concerned about, and I was listening to the whole presentation in the changes in the refining of the oil sands related to from Alberta. I mean, those are different levels of technology today, and some of the concerns that are being voiced out there in certain communities are concerns that maybe would have had validity 30 years ago. Aren't today. And I think the debate is not dissimilar when it comes to fracking, which is a particularly powerful debate and issue in New York today. So there are major problems and objections that we're going to run into in looking at this. But a future that is both cleaner and is where the United States becomes a strong energy exporter. And let me give you a great little story from the lower 48. And that's Wyoming. Wyoming in the last 10 years has seen its per capita spending on public education grow faster than any other state in the country. And they went from rankings in the 40s across the board in all the major categories of student performance in a little over a decade to being up in the teens, the largest growth of any state in the country. And how did they do that? They had a stable energy policy. And the example I use is Montana. Montana has far-right Republicans and far-left Democrats, and their legislatures flip back and forth as much as any legislature in the country because the public there, quite frankly, just aren't comfortable with either side, and so whoever's in power they have to toss 2 years later. It's been pretty similar with governors, not quite to the same degree. But it becomes a real challenge for them because there's no stability in their state's energy policy. Montana has 8 times the coal of Wyoming. Wyoming exports 8 times as much coal as Montana does. So Montana has 8 times the amount that Wyoming has, but Wyoming's able to sell 8 times as much. And that's why the Wyoming economy has been booming. They really didn't see 2009 as a particularly bad year in Wyoming. There were some communities that were impacted badly, but most of the state is now driven by an energy-based economy, and it's been a real boom for them. So these are the kinds of examples where and you can just listen to the stories that are coming out of North Dakota. Obviously there's strength here in Alaska, but again, the regulatory burdens put on the energy sector in Alaska are also significant, and we have to figure out how do we level the playing field so that Alaska is able to utilize its resources in a fair and equitable way to the citizens of this state, and in a way that our natural environment and the beauty of the state is still preserved. So those are the big challenges. And I'm going to take a little sidebar on energy because this is a piece where the U.S. Chamber's position is often not well understood. We have a clean, emerging and clean technologies committee. We actually put a tremendous amount of resources into promoting new technologies that are expanding the playing field. But we also come back to the fact that the resources that we have right now that we know how to extract and use are also a key component to the U.S. economy moving forward. So you've got a two-faceted energy policy. There was a side study done about 2 years ago by our Environmental Policy Division called Project No Project. And it showed that 300 major energy development projects in America stalled by regulatory or community protests, regulatory hurdles or community protest. What was interesting about that is slightly more than half of those were clean technology products, including wind and solar as well as hydro. So it wasn't, everyone thinks, well, the problem with, energy is, well, we're stopping all this old stuff, that dirty coal, dirty oil. We're going to this solar and wind and stuff. Actually, they're having just as hard a time as the other side is. And it's an interesting thing to look at in the much bigger picture when the Department of Defense says that over the next 30 years, the biggest national security concern for the United States is its own energy independence. Well, we're saying we know we've got the oil reserves, the coal reserves, we've got the greatest engineers and thinkers in the world coming together, building new technologies and bringing new ideas to the marketplace. Energy can be the future of this country, and it can be such a major component and driver of an economic rebirth of the United States that that can go if we are willing to take some bold and courageous policy decisions, can be a huge component of solving our national financial crisis that we're facing. We can get the U.S. economy growing again. We can add economic growth to the glide path to reducing that massive, massive unsustainable national debt that we have today. So those are the pieces. Those are the three pieces. We've got to have real entitlement reform. We've got to rewrite the tax code. And we've got to embrace energy as an economic engine for this country. It is not the only engine by any stretch, but it is a key engine, and it's one that we seem to be putting more and more regulatory hurdles on and fewer efforts to try to exploit the potential for our citizens and putting people back to work in this country. So I ask, and I know we have representatives from Senator Murkowski's office and Senator Begich's office here. What I'm asking of all of you is not only to talk to them, but next time the senators come through town or to make phone calls to their offices in Washington, D.C., we have to have voices saying, we need a grand deal. We need to put politics on the back burner, and we need to put our country first here. We need a grand deal that we can help move America forward. Because if we're not, and if we can't do it, and we let this devolve through partisan bickering, the way we've seen almost every solution that's been raised, and every time we have a new gang of six in the Senate, I've lost track of the number of gangs of sixes we've had now. There seems to be a deal, there seems to be really smart ideas, and somebody on one end or the other of Pennsylvania Avenue just decides, I've got to deal with my party's base, rather than try to look after the interests of the American people and getting America back to work. So that is the message. Please contact your federal delegation. I do have to tell you, Senator Murkowski has been one of the strongest business voices in the United States Senate. So she is, when you look at our scorecard and our rankings and our standards, we always ask legislators, and we support legislators who have a 70% cumulative voting record with the U.S. Chamber, which is on a broad range of business issues. Every senator's let know ahead of time what issues that are coming up that may be on the scorecard. We send out key vote letters. We don't surprise anybody. We wish we had more people from both sides voting with us. Unfortunately, we've lost so many blue dog Democrats that the pro-business vote on the Democratic side has gone down a little bit in the last few years. But we're really trying to build that back up and encourage Democrats to come across and start supporting the American business community more robustly. But I do want to especially acknowledge Senator Murkowski, because she's been one of the very top business voices in the entire United States Senate. So with that said, please contact your federal delegation. They have got to hear from you. They've got to know that you get this. And, I hate to say it, but the reality and the cost of not dealing with the fiscal cliff is the very republic that we were pledging to. And God bless you all if you can help us get us back on track. So with that, I'm open to questions, and thank you so much.
Okay, we'll have you go ahead and stand up and introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Marianne Ray. You talked a lot about tax increases. What about reducing spending? I realize that the entitlement programs are the 800-pound gorilla,
Yeah.
but we're putting a lot of money into military budgets, and I don't personally think we need all of that in there. We've got a lot of unnecessary spending going on, and the government doesn't seem to be able to make the cuts.
We've seen in the last 4 years the largest growth of federal employees of any four-year presidential period in the last since I think it's since 1964. I mean, there's some challenges that we have with spending. The reason I'm not standing up here and saying we want these specific spending cuts, there's a whole range of them, is we're trying to frame the big issue. We've got to have the reduction in the size of government. Now, I agree with you completely that the discretionary spending, every part of it has to be looked at. I'm a big supporter of pay for play, and making sure that every time we spend new money, that's offset somewhere. There's been good work. There've been small reforms going on. Earmarks have been, I don't want to say eliminated, but they've been reduced dramatically. Ironically enough, though, some of the most fiscally conservative states in the Union, like Alaska and Wyoming, are also the most dependent because of the spread of people. So that becomes a challenging issue, and we have to look at those pragmatically. But yes, discretionary spending is part of the deal. But the 800-pound gorilla is the fact that the entitlement programs, and particularly Medicare and Medicaid, but the three of them together will take over the entire budget. And if we don't get a handle on them, then
We all have to kick in, so does the government.
I agree. Of course.
It's something that really bothers me in light of the fact when I look at what I get a year, being over 70, and I have to pay for my own haircuts, my own meals, my own car or bus. Why doesn't the government cut what these guys in the government are getting for free limos, free flights around the world by saying one thing political, free meals? I mean, the list goes on and on. That's where these cuts need to start, not the guy like me.
I could tell you stories that curl your hair about congressional junkets. And, we see stories, some of the just humiliating stories that came out of the General Services Administration. We've seen a number of issues from DOD spending recently. It is horrifying. And, one of the challenges of government, as I was in the state legislature in Washington State, I was on the Capital Budget Committee as well as Financial Services, and we were looking at infrastructure spending, but then I was also on Joint Budget Task Force. And so in that capacity, we're looking at all types of state spending. The one thing I truly came away with, and I'd always sort of natively understood this, but truly understood, is that government is an inefficient user of resources. The private sector is vastly more efficient because they are accountable at the bottom line. In government, budgets are basically set, and if you don't spend it all, you don't get as much the next year. You don't get your increase. So, I always love the political speak that you hear in campaigns where, oh, you're cutting this program 80%. Well, the cut is 80% of the asked for increase, not 80% of the program in many cases. And so it's the duplicity, the double speak. Those things really become challenging. And your question goes to something that I believe deeply, and that is in this country. And there's always been a healthy skepticism of government, but really government. You look at Congress in particular and the approval rankings of Congress. They've lost the trust of the American people in a way that's so fundamental that I actually think it makes it even harder for them as electeds to be able to go back and listen to the larger voice of the country as opposed to the small but very vocal minorities at the very extreme fringes of the two parties. And that's a challenge we have. Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Great question. My name is Rick Shack. I want to thank you for coming and talking about this really important topic. I think it's on a lot of people's minds after the election. I'd just like to add something to what she was saying. That is, I don't think it was ever meant to be that when you get elected to the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, it becomes a lifelong gravy train.
Yeah.
I think their benefits and their package needs to be cut. Now, I'm not talking about cutting their local representatives who can come out and talk to people.
Right.
The meals and the health care and everything else. And, before they start taking it to the knife dust, they need to look at their own benefits.
Now, I'm going to do something unpopular. And again, I have to tell you that Congress has done a lot. Going back to 1994, and both parties have done tried to one-up one another. In typical political fashion, it's often not really been for the sense of reform, but rather the sense of showing, well, we're better than the other side. But there have actually been enough reforms, like today the health care program that members of Congress have is the same health care program that other federal employees have. So there are some fundamental changes that have been made to it. There is a retirement program plan that's being reformed right now for them. There have been changes made. The junketeering is nowhere near on the scale that it used to be, although I would also be the first one to say that the last thing we want to do is cut off all international travel because the U.S. economy is as interdependent on the rest of the world's economies as vice versa. And so we have to find that fine balance and who do you want to pay for that travel? Because many times there are interest groups that want to pay for the travel, but if they pay for the travel, do they control the agenda of the visitors? Of course they do. Whereas if the government pays for the travel, then there is a more equitable ability. But looking at those and scrutinizing those, making sure that your local reporters are writing about the travel that your members of Congress are doing so that you have full disclosure. You can make those choices. Yeah, that was a reasonable decision to go here because of the brewing conflict, or I get that, or I understand going to that location. But Barbados, I just don't see the national need right now to 2 weeks on the beach. No, I'm not saying I've never heard of anybody do 2 weeks of beating up in Barbados.
There are a couple dozen tax-exempt charitable organizations that use the Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, and pair up with the EPA, and together with their huge tax-exempt endowments into the hundreds of billions of dollars, can shut down any resource plan pretty much anywhere in the country, resource development. What is the Chamber or the National Chamber doing to clean up and fix regulations so that we can develop our resources and put America back to work?
And that is a completely valid description of the challenge. We're embroiled in multiple lawsuits now. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The last place we want to be is in a lawsuit. But as a issue of last resort with the federal bureaucracy, we will end up taking them to court over various regulatory activities that have gone on. Certainly, putting the light of day on the regulatory activities that and having Congress play a more aggressive oversight role in the very activities that you're talking about, I think becomes a very key component to being able to bring this issue forward. And yes, I am being a little careful in what I say because there are a lot of, you're hitting on one of the most powerful topics facing this country in terms of both the energy export and the ability to use energy as a basis for renewal of our economy, and particularly the ability to export it. And we're going to have to do that, and so we're going to have to figure out how to do this. Do I stand here today and have the answer on how to do that? No. But I will tell you that there is a lot of work and a lot of activity. An entity 10 years ago in my life I never knew anything about was the Tides Foundation in San Francisco. They're the largest manager of foundation money around the country. But it was really interesting to read their political agenda. And it really becomes absolutely fascinating. If you want to understand how the very radical side, the anti-growth side in this country is funded, you can see it through the management of foundation funds. Ironically enough, even some from very conservative foundations. And it really is, it is a challenge we face. Yes, sir.
My name is Luke Fanning. I'm from First National Bank.
Thank you.
I really don't mean to sound cynical, but the country's been inundated with a lot of rhetoric excuse me, about taxation rates that's at best misleading.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to support a grand bargain, how do we get people to understand the difference between corporate tax rates on dividends and capital gains versus personal tax rates? And get our politicians to emphasize that it's not just a 15% tax rate on dividends that we're talking about.
Right. Boy, you know what? I wouldn't be the regional executive director if I could answer that question 100%. I think Tom Donahue would be you know, the problem for me, I mean, when I left elected office, the challenge, even though the vast majority of the folks on both parties in the state legislature in Washington I was close friends with, but there was a cynicism that I'd already seen in D.C. in the way people politicked and campaigned that was creeping into the state legislative ethos. Yeah, in the state legislature, about 97% of the legislation that we passed was non-controversial, and all sides agreed upon it. It's the 3% that we fought over. But the 3% that we fought over was being drawn down in simpler and simpler terms in a way to gain political advantage rather than educate. And it was hard. I lost a lot of sleep over that. If I had the answer on how we can get politicians to go out there. Now, I will give you one example. Now, this was, I nearly fell over backwards. The Boise Chamber of Commerce, and I sometimes joke about the Boise Chamber as kind of resembling a John Birch Society meeting. They're pretty darn conservative there. The congressman from eastern Idaho, who represents probably the one of the 3 or 4 most conservative congressional districts in the entire country, former Speaker of the State House, now a member of Congress, came in and said, look, this debt is such a problem for us, and we're going to have to fix this in a bipartisan way. I'm not going to promise that if we can get the right deal that's a pro-growth deal, that you won't see some tax increases. But you have one party that said absolutely no taxes, no tax increases, no way. You have another party that really wants to force the other party to break their word, which has happened in the past for disastrous political terms. And the two sides do seem to be sitting out there waiting for the other one to blink and waiting to take political advantage rather than fix the problem. Am I answering your question? No, not exactly. I'm just saying that's why you're seeing exactly that, and it's why the cynicism is healthy. Because I don't know that we'll get the job done, but God help us if we don't. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Debbie White, Prudential Southeast Alaska Real Estate. I'm also a member of the National Association of Realtors,
Yep.
and I'm wondering why the Chamber of Commerce doesn't have something similar to our call to action program, where you get the email and you can just with a few clicks be able to contact your congressional representatives, or even state ones. I would think when you were in the state legislature in Washington, that you were able to get those.
We do have a program like that. Individual chambers, we offer it as a membership benefit to chambers. It's a back-end program, but it is exactly like call to action. But again, it is part of our relationship with our local chambers. We do have specific email lists that you can sign up for. I will warn you that if you sign up for the email list, just expect 3 to 4 a day, because even I have a hard time reading all of the ones that go out on that side of things. By the time I'm done with my policy briefings, if I read all of those, my 10 hours of the day would be gone. it's something we certainly can look at. And again, I don't know.
I can forward them to you, Debbie.
Okay.
Oh, great.
I don't mind that at all. Anybody else that wants me to forward the U.S. Chamber emails and calls to action, I'd be more than happy to just let you know.
Okay. Thank you.
So, and I do want to say, on the realtor side, because I worked very closely with realtors over the years. When I was in the state legislature, I did communications consulting work. One of my clients was a county realtors organization in Washington State. The home mortgage interest deduction is probably the single biggest tax exemption that's essentially off the table. You could potentially see a very, very small reduction in the top end. But other than that, it's off the table because that is something that would so disproportionately hit the sector that's been hit the hardest in the post-2008 downturn that we would still be back to square one in terms of struggling with housing cost issues.
It's Drew Green with Cruise on Agencies, North Pacific Maritime. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Our company is having a hard time grappling with healthcare costs, and now with Obamacare, we're still trying to fathom out the taxation that bills and impacts for our so-called our copay plan is a Cadillac plan apparently, so
right.
we penalized further. So could you comment on Obamacare and business?
So interestingly, the U.S. Chamber took a neutral position on Obamacare as a whole, but we fiercely opposed the employer mandate. That was the component that was most troubling to us. Obamacare really fundamentally is one of the issues that is creating this degree of anxiety and uncertainty for the business community. When we did a survey last summer, and this was out of our 3 million members nationwide, of the respondents, and there's vast, I can't remember the exact number of respondents, 90% indicated that they were holding back on either investing in new plant, equipment, infrastructure, or new hires. There's huge amounts of cash sitting back. And, a lot of people talked about the cash that big business in America has. There's huge amounts of cash being hoarded right now by small and mid-sized business in America, and it's because of this degree of uncertainty. And there were 3 issues. First was fiscal cliff. That was the first one. And, when you're a large multi-million-dollar Fortune 500 company, you can afford to employ people who can sit there and think about the potential impact of the fiscal cliff and how it's going to impact your business. If you are a small or mid-sized business, you're probably in there right now in this economy struggling every minute of every day just trying to keep your doors open, keeping your people employed. And that is... So you look at fiscal cliff. The number 2 issue was Obamacare. What's it going to mean to us? And, of course, the regulatory stuff is being written right now. And, I've got some states are doing state exchanges. Other states are refusing to do it because they don't want to participate in this whole thing. And so they're going to be subject to a federal exchange. I'm acutely aware of the obscenely high cost in Alaska of employers offering health insurance, and I'm also aware of the fact that just about every employer plan is being classified as Cadillac up here. I mean, there's some just fundamental inequities that this state suffers through, and in particular are being highlighted by this legislation. What it means to you, I don't know. What Congress is going to do on it, I don't know. I will be back a lot in the next couple of years. As I get updates, I'm in fact flying to Washington, D.C. early next week. We're going to be taking a look at what happened in the election and what that's likely to mean on the federal legislative agenda for next year. I look forward to having a continued dialogue with you and being one of the participants that you have in this community. You've got great U.S. senators and a member of Congress up here. I'd encourage you to continue to contact them, both from an advocacy point of view, but they can also be a voice of information. But we would also like to be a participant in that dialogue. And I guess that's basically the best I can offer you right now. I don't have the answer as to what the fix is going to be, what kind of fixes are going to be looked at, or whether they will be politically feasible when we get done with the fight that's going to be the fiscal cliff. And the third one, by the way, there was a third one. The third one was broader regulatory expansion. We also saw over the past 4 years the highest regulatory expansion, and we're now seeing $23 billion. And, you know, when you start talking about $23 billion, it doesn't sound like very much when you're talking about $17 trillion. But $23 billion a month being pulled out of the U.S. economy just by regulations that have been enacted within the last 4 years. So that is yet another drag that we have. Yes, ma'am. Sorry.
When we're talking about tax cuts, or what I think about is, I was back in D.C. last year, and I remember Senator Begich was talking to us, and he was explaining how in 2010, GE Corporation paid zero tax.
Mm-hmm.
I paid more income tax. I'm sure everybody in America paid more income tax. And when I think about taxing businesses or taxing people or increasing our tax, my thought immediately goes to, when you're telling me the oil industry is making, oh, we had a terrible year, we only made $140 billion instead of $300 billion, I have issues with that, and I have issues with companies like GE Corporation having so many tax credits that they net $1 billion in 2010, net, bottom line, which is astronomical, and pay no income tax. And so my request is that the chamber look at, you know.
Well, that was, just so you're clear on that, that was exactly what I said when I said up front, we are committed on behalf of the business community, including companies that have had very favorable treatment. And we do ask companies to put their personal individual interests at the door and look at the big picture, because our mission is to protect free enterprise. We do want to look at some of the exemptions that are in place. Now, I will tell you that the energy exploration tax credits are a very complex issue, because some of the amazing changes that we're seeing right now in terms of the United States becoming a net energy exporter are being driven by what would otherwise be quite risky permitting process. And I'm not defending it. I'm just saying there's entire another side to that issue, that if we get rid of that, are we going to disincentivize this very thing that has had a net stimulating effect to the economy and has great potential for us? But paying a much fairer, consistent rate where companies can plan ahead, they can understand what they're going to pay. And the GE story. Now, I've seen information, and I want to say that's been refuted. I know it's still being printed in the press today, but I seem to remember GE came out a year later, did a fairly comprehensive look at what they did pay, and I think they did actually pay substantial net taxes, not anywhere near the ordinary tax rate, but so I think the zero, in fact, in the end, was understood and believed genuinely to be correct, but I don't think it actually was. This is just something I'm remembering off the top of my head, so I certainly wouldn't stake my career on it. But we do also have to be careful with the information too, because there are times where it turns out to be not quite as accurate as we hope. Every tax credit, every tax incentive that was put in place, there was somebody making a case for it that somebody thought was compelling. And we did this in Washington State when I was there. We eliminated a lot of tax exemptions. But the very next year, some of the very same people who'd been advocating for the elimination of business tax exemptions were coming back and saying, well, this had an impact we didn't really think of, and maybe we ought to look at a way to help this group Y get at least some of that, particularly in Washington, which has a very complex business and occupancy tax structure, get some of their tax incentives back. So it's a really tough challenge, but that's where the largest financial component in terms of increasing revenue to the federal government is going to come from in a grand bargain. I don't think there is any will to increase absolute rates for anybody, and right now the American business tax rate as a whole is so high that we have companies doing everything they can, multinational companies doing everything they can to pay taxes in other countries, including in Europe, because the rates are lower over there. If we can find out how to make our tax code for business both consistent so they can plan on it in the long run and competitive, then actually we will probably see a net. So even reducing the overall rates will probably help our country in the long run see a substantial increase because it will make us more competitive and growth oriented.